Hello, this is Bret Hayworth with the Sioux City Journal. I'm welcoming Jeremy Taylor here into our studio today to answer some questions. This is for a series of stories, video stories as well, on the Iowa 4th Congressional District race, which is coming up very soon here. The voting is ongoing with early voting right now, and the election itself is on Tuesday, June 2nd. So thank you for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brett.
You bet. And one thing has impacted the race as we've gone on is obviously the coronavirus, the spread of coronavirus throughout the state and nation. And that meant that you candidates probably early mid-March stopped doing in-person appearances, and I know that's greatly impacted, and we can talk about that, about what you're doing to get around that. But with a lot of the restrictions that were placed being now lifted by Governor Kim Reynolds, could you see in these last few days, and we're down to the last few days, could in-person campaigning resume here in the last few days or up to the primary, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I think those events, we're able to have meetings like this and interviews. We did have an in-person debate today. But in terms of going door to door and putting together events, it's really something that in these last few days is not very practical. For us, that's meant that we're relying upon the 17,000 miles that we put on prior, the over 60 endorsements that we earned from elected officials to veterans and faith leaders. And we're really leveraging that now. Those activists and those conservatives that have friends and family networks, church groups, phone calling. And so we like the fact that we put in a lot of work early. We've been running in this race for about a year and a half. And so with that, probably not very practical just in this last week's window.
Okay. And thank you for explaining some of the things that you've done. Is it so that really the county committees, the Republican county committees, are just not holding events the way that they would normally have been, where you could show up at, whatever town?
Right. I think it's become very impractical to have things at a restaurant and have 20 or 30 or 40 people. I will credit our central committees across the 39 counties. They've done a good job of having Zoom meetings and ample opportunities. At this point, if you haven't heard from one of the five of us in the central committee meetings or debates, they've done a good job of really pushing that out and allowing many virtual forums and debates in order to be able to get our message across.
And you still feel, though, that you're making connections in the way that you want to make connections?
Absolutely, and I think it really becomes the trust of those that we lay the groundwork. There's about, typically in this race, 45,000 who would vote. We're pushing 60,000 absentee requests, so that's a different dynamic. There will more likely be more voters than in a typical primary election. But we like the fact that we earned trust by working so hard and by being out in the counties. And that's something to me as a congressman that's very important, not just to be in the counties during an election year where things get a little heated or close. I think to do the sort of the Grassley tour every one of the 39 counties multiple times every year is something that I've committed to, not just on the campaign trail, but as long as I would be in elected office.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to ask this question a little bit later, but since you brought it up, I wanted to get into that. President Trump has tweeted and spoken pretty demonstratively against a lot of early voting, mail-in voting, I should say. And here in Iowa, Paul Pate, our Secretary of State, has requested, has pushed everyone to try to do that as much as possible. And you've seen what's happening in Woodbury County and all these other counties. Do you have concerns about voter fraud the way that President Trump explains it?
I do, by going to an all-mail ballot. I'm not in favor of that. I do think that there needs to be certain protections. I think that there's a higher propensity if you go to select all-mail balloting. I do also think that there's an accessibility issue. I'm glad that we're opening up more fronts for people to be able to vote. I think that there are people who are dead set, and I think rightfully so, about going out to the polls, and by being able to, at least in our case, access 5 sites, that makes it, I think, even a healthier situation by dispersing to not one centrally located place. For me, I think it's an accessibility issue for those who want to go and they want to vote in person and want to have that vote, have the safety and surety of it being counted to a greater degree than they may trust through the mail.
Okay, and at this point of our conversation, I guess I'd like you to talk about your professional life, your career, and where you've gotten to this point, and why you feel like that your arc of your life to this point would make you a good congressman?
Absolutely. So I take my experiences over the last 10 years in public service, and that really started by following in my parents' footsteps as a teacher who wanted to let this younger generation know about our greatest generation who sacrificed so much for us. And so I brought in 12 World War II veterans to inspire my students, but they inspired me to enlist at a later than normal age at 29 years old. And during my journey as an intel analyst, I saw a lot of younger soldiers that were struggling. I was able to share my faith with them, and by the time I was done with my training, I felt an even higher call to become a chaplain, and I serve today as a major and a chaplain at a time where less than a fifth of those in Congress have served, and so believe that that's important life experience to be able to bring. I also served in the Iowa State House, was able in a divided government, which could very well be the case, though I hope we have a new conservative majority, to pass 6 significant pieces of legislation, floor manage those into law, and then help turn around a county that after 3 decades needed transparency and needed to move forward, and over 5 years point to substantive accomplishments that we were able to move forward. And so I've supported Steve King in the past, and I've supported him in the primaries, and people know that are out there voting in this primary, but after he lost our county by 3,000 or more votes in an election where Governor Reynolds and I won by a margin of nearly 4,000, I knew it was time. And I knew it was time because we start off as Republicans with a 22% lead. Well, that was whittled down to just 3%, and that was before losing committee assignments and a partnership with President Trump. I've taken an approach to this race that has honored his service, respected him and what he's done, but said, as so many others have said now, it's time, and it's time to move on, to have somebody who can advocate on the Ag Committee for the renewable fuel standard, for fair beef pricing, for making sure that our family farms are represented well, and for those that care about the issues of life and the Second Amendment and our historic rights and values and getting control of a now $26 trillion national debt. I'm somebody who sees myself as a constitutionalist who will fight just as hard, but do so with some added wisdom in navigating some of those waters.
Thank you for that. And I did have one Steve King specific question, and you kind of went into that territory. So let me just kind of as a follow-up, as someone who's out there trying to make inroads and win this primary, what signs of Steve King fatigue have you seen? Like how has that demonstrated itself that you could point to?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, people respect the constitutionalist fighter, that it's not someone who's just been a go-along to get along Republican. One thing that I've asked so many Republicans is what happened when Republicans had control of the House and the Senate and the presidency? And almost without a doubt, in more than 75 events, the answer comes back, not a whole lot. There's deep disappointment.
So this would be 2017 and 2018.
Right. So when basically there was the trifecta. And then whittled away, too often Republicans campaign as conservatives. And then when they go, instead of being change agents, they sort of conform to the situation at hand and don't follow through. So there's appreciation there. At the same time, I talked to many people who are deeply worried and concerned about winning the general election, as well as making sure that we don't unnecessarily spend political capital. And I believe that some of that has been done on issues that don't advance the cause of life, don't stand for our historic rights and values, aren't pounding the podium and saying we need a balanced budget amendment, or we need term limits, or we need it so that Congress passes about 150 pieces of legislation every year, but yet we have over 60,000 pages on the Federal Register of rules and regulations that unelected bureaucrats are formulating. And so I want to spend my time and my efforts on advocating for those issues that families are talking about and that actually advance the conservative cause. My approach has been very different than Randy Feenstra's. I believe that Randy Feenstra has alienated a lot of conservatives by, for example, going on CNN, on Don Lemon's show, attacking Steve King, a lot of the outside money influence of moderate PACs that I don't believe have our constitutional principles in mind. And so for me, it's really about being, the analogy I've heard and used is it's the first string quarterback whose time has come and gone, and yet you don't dislike that person or necessarily disrespect him, but through maybe a myriad of unforced errors and some instances or unfortunate circumstances have combined to say, it's time. And so with that, respect what he's been able to do, but believe the last couple of years we have not had the effectiveness that's needed. And then going forward, I believe that we'll lose a general election if Steve King's our nominee.
Okay, thank you. How do you feel like you're sitting with your fundraising? I think, are you pretty much about where Steve King is in terms of cash on hand?
I would say that's
you're like second, third.
Right, about 100. We raised about 160,000 total.
Okay, and are you? I'm sorry, one more Steve King specific question. Mm-hmm. Do you know? Are you getting some donors that people that donate to you that previously donated to Steve King?
Yeah, I would say that that's the majority of our funding has been, and I point to that with no small amount of pride, in the sense that those who are looking for a constitutionalist, I stop using the term conservative, see in me somebody who will be equally stalwart, that won't compromise unnecessarily, and by that I mean on principle, rather than sometimes it takes some strategy. And I did that in the Iowa House. I walked over to the Judiciary Committee. I talked to Senate Democrats, was able to pass tougher sentencing laws, a couple bills that had languished for 3 or 4 years on behalf of veterans and domestic abuse victims. But at the same time, they trust that when they're supporting me, that I'm not going to compromise on principles, and that I'm not going to be malleable, and I'm not going to compromise on principles. If I say I'm going to do something, that word is my bond there. And I believe that conservatives have trusted that, and so look to that as more than outside PACs weighing in at 4 or 5 times money. I actually think that that's hurt in this race, and I think that will bear it out.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask an issues question, and then we'll wrap up, kind of go back to some horse race questions type here. And you hit a few issues, but tell me the top 2 issues that are most important to you as you campaign here in the middle of 2020.
Yeah, so I think getting control of the size and scope of the federal government in a way that actually works for families is critically important. I talked about a now $26 trillion national debt. That costs every man, woman, and child for $75,000 that is owed to the federal government. We're spending $1 billion a day in interest, most of which is owned by China, ironically. I think in 10 years' time, if we don't have control of this, we're going to spend more in interest than we do on national defense. And the federal government is taking about 1/4 of our entire private economy. At the same time, it has more power and control than it ever has over issues ranging from education to healthcare in a way that doesn't help people ultimately. And so I think that that's a critical issue. Congress has only passed 4 budgets since 1977, and we have omnibus bills, we have catch-all continuing resolutions, and I think it's a sign of ill health. The other issue to me that's critically important is the issue of life. As a chaplain, a husband, and a father, I have earned the support of the lead counsel for Iowa's heartbeat bill. I advocate to those conservatives that want a voice on the life issue. We have to be able to sit on judiciary. I mean, that's where life is introduced. And so I'm somebody that has rolled out a 10-part Defend Life plan. That includes the federal heartbeat bill. That includes defunding abortion providers overseas and at home, but also doubling the adoption tax credit and making it fully refundable. In my extended family, we've championed the cause of life and have several nieces and nephews and cousins that have been adopted, and I think that we need to put that forward. And if I could just add one in, if that's okay. Our Iowa ag economy, we have 1 in every 5 jobs that is tied to ag, and we need to have an effective voice on committees fighting for the RFS, for fair beef pricing, and for making sure that our supply chain for food is unbroken, especially as it's been tried and tested during this time.
Okay, thank you for that. And you brought up Randy Feenstra at one point in one of your answers. Do you see it as a 2-person race based on some of the polling? There's no outside polling from my understanding. It's been internal polls that have been released. Right. Do you believe it's a 2-person race between King and Feenstra, or what's your plan for inroads? Not just inroads, but to win.
Right. So I don't believe it's a 2-person race. I believe that there's 3 of us, and I would say that you have other candidates who are running very hard as well. So I don't take the internal polls with anything but a very large grain of salt. I said the same thing when Steve King pushed his poll out early on, and now when Randy Feenstra has as well. We've been calling through Woodbury County And honestly, it's been between Steve King and myself in terms of those that were advocating want to have a constitutionalist. And so that's where we're at in terms of the race. We just put up over 700 yard signs here at home and like where we're at. We also like the fact that we've been in the other counties. And I think that's a difference between Senator Feenstra and myself. Iowa has a history of not electing Jeb Bushes, who spend a lot of money and sometimes can finish dead last. And I always am suspect of polls. This was the same thing with President Trump that you saw where Hillary Clinton was supposedly 11 points ahead. I saw the same thing with Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee, where they said, you know, you're only going to gain 2 to 3%, and they both went on to win Iowa. And so that's our plan, is to continue to do the hard work, run through the finish line, and we believe we'll be successful on June 2nd.
Thank you. I want you to go back to one more point there. I think this is something that you and I had talked about previously, but isn't there a certain percentage, what percentage of votes of the overall 4th District would come from Woodbury County? And if you get a certain percent, then you saw that there was a path to
right
there.
So almost 1 in every 5 will come out of Woodbury County, and that can be 1 out of every 5 or 6. We've had an enormous amount of interest right here at home, which we really, really like. I've also seen, you know, we've had upwards of 10,000 of those who have requested, out of 60,000, requested an absentee ballot here at home. So I noticed Randy Feenstra pointed to number 2 over in Sioux County. Well, we doubled that number. And so we like that fact very much, plus the fact that we've been in the other counties so often and put on so many other miles.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for talking out about, not only about the campaign, but of course about the issues. And again, thank you for coming in
Thank you for
speaking
having me.
to me and essentially the Journal readers. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brett.